We are here tonight to discuss a new book, what I consider a profound and deeply moving and novel work, and that's Homeward, Life in the Year After Prison by Bruce Western. Bruce received his BA from the University of Queensland in Australia, and he earned a PhD in sociology from UCLA, where he studied under Yvonne Selene. He then came to Princeton and taught in the sociology department, where he did, some amazing work. Then he moved to Harvard in 2007, where he directed the Malcolm Wiener Center for Social Policy, was a Guggenheim Professor of Criminal Justice Policy at the Kennedy School of Government, and co-founded with me the Justice and Poverty Project, which worked to promote a deeper understanding of severe deprivation, mass incarceration, and housing insecurity in America. Bruce is currently a professor of sociology at Columbia University. He's also the co-founder and co-director of the Justice Lab, whose mission statement reads in full as follows. The Justice Lab combines original research, policy development, and community engagement to propel the project of justice reform. In our vision, justice depends on peaceful and healthy communities that help all their members to flourish in a climate of fairness and respect. We work for a community-centered justice in which incarceration is no longer used as a solution to problems that are often rooted in poverty and racial inequality. That's the mission statement of a professional social science lab. Bruce has authored or edited 7 books and dozens of influential academic studies on economic inequality, unions and labor markets, and the criminal justice system, including his 2006 book, Punishment and Inequality in America, which really has fundamentally reshaped the way social science and public policy understands mass incarceration, because the book chronicles the rise of the prison boom and the human wreckage of it. All those depressing statistics we now know about mass incarceration and racial inequality, they probably came from Bruce. An elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences, Bruce's work represents a kind of sociology humbled by the full complexity of life. It's a thick, unsettled sociology that accepts no easy answers. It's a reflexive sociology that hard earns its claims, and it's a sociology that hates poverty and injustice. And just speaking personally, if I were forced to choose one person who has the most influence on my thinking and my intellectual development, it would be Bruce Western. His intellectual rigor and humility is matched only by this true, honest desire to make a difference in the lives of those who are so often overlooked and disparaged in larger society. So, Bruce, welcome back to Princeton. Thank you for your continued work and all that you've done to make me a better thinker and a better anti-poverty advocate. My name is Matt Desmond. I'm a professor of sociology here at Princeton, and the format tonight is going to be just a conversation. So we're going to talk about this new book. We're going to talk about what you did to put into it, what you learned from men and women coming out of prison, and what we can do going forward, and then we'll open it up for questions, and then there'll be a book signing immediately after. Sound good? All right, so, hey, Bruce.
Hey, Matt.
So I want to start off a bit about with a question about intellectual trajectory. So you started your work working on the labor market, working on post-war unionization. That took you and brought you into a focus on criminal justice and incarceration, but mainly as a statistician. You were in the numbers, you were estimating the prevalence of incarceration, the causes and the consequences. But this new book is something entirely different. This is a humanistic book, it's a humanizing book that talks to people face-to-face right after they get out of prison in Boston. And so just tell us how you got here.
Yeah. I think, let me begin by saying thank you so much for the invitation for this conversation this afternoon. And Princeton occupies such a special place for me, and I'm so grateful to be back and to be speaking with you here today. It was a long road, and I guess there are a few different answers to your question. And so one is intellectual. I was doing a lot of research on the causes, the scope, the consequences of incarceration in the United States. I was analyzing big data sets and that weren't particularly designed to study, for example, the transition from prison to communities, and I was trying to leverage what information they had in order to gain some sort of insight into that question. At the same time as I was doing that big social science data analysis on the effects of incarceration, I was also going into prisons a lot. I was teaching in prison. Patricia Fernandez-Kelly invited me for the first time to go into New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, and she and I taught classes there. So I was getting to meet people. I was getting to learn about their lives, and the kinds of data analysis I was doing, which often reduced people to their age, their sex, their race, and their level of schooling. The kinds of data analysis I was doing was not capturing the richness of people's lives as I was coming to understand them. And I was worried a lot about undercoverage, which in social survey methodology means that people are being undersampled, particularly for those who are very socially and economically marginal. Our data sources are just missing them. So I tried to design a piece of research that would gain closer proximity to the lived experience of incarceration and its immediate aftermath. That's the intellectual answer. I was trying to improve on the science that I was doing until that point. I think that there's kind of another kind of answer as well. I was increasingly becoming dismayed, I suppose, about criminal justice policy and politics, which I thought could be very, very dehumanizing of people, reducing them, to the very worst things that they had ever done in their lives. And I was out and about trying to talk about my quantitative research and giving congressional testimony and talking to legislators and having all sorts of policy conversations. And I thought, the numbers that I was presenting would speak for themselves. And strangely,
because they're crazy numbers, right? These estimates were just morally outrageous. Right?
So our incarceration rates are 5 times higher than the historical average. If we think about black men born since the mid-1970s, if they dropped out of high school, 70% now have prison records.
Right.
And you only have to go back a generation to find a time when incarceration just was not a pervasive presence in the lives of black men with low levels of schooling. And that was a policy choice. And so I was alarmed by that. I thought everyone else would be automatically tuned into that as a social crisis. But it wasn't the case. And so I wanted this project in part to be humanizing of the people who are entangled in the criminal justice system in a way that I don't think I was successful earlier. I have to say too, so we talked in this book, we talked to 130, 140 people. We got to know them quite well over a year. They gave a lot to us of their experience and their time. And I wanted a book that I thought could do justice to their contribution to my research. And it was sort of at some level, I mean, we talked about this, right? Who's the audience for this book? Because sometimes it's not always completely social science. I don't think it could quite penetrate a general audience. And I would say to you, well, the people I talk to, I would like them to be an audience for this book.
Right. Yeah. I promise I won't ask you any more methods questions, but I think just to start off, so you talked to, 120, 130 folks, and you interviewed them 5 times, right? Is that right? Starting in prison?
That's right.
and then following them throughout for a year. And one thing that makes this study stand out is its retention rate. A lot of the folks, when you're dealing with a hard-to-reach population, right, you call them 1 month, and then a few months pass, and you can't get them. And that's the whole career of most studies like this. But you guys did something different. You got an incredibly high retention rate.
Yeah.
And could you just, what's the secret sauce?
I mean, this was kind of our mission. Retention was our mission.
Yeah.
And we saw it as really a fatal flaw for a lot of other research on people coming out of prison. And I thought that was really problematic because I worried that the people who were most marginal, so we were in Boston, we were talking to people coming out of state prison in Massachusetts and following them over the course of a year. A lot of people were homeless, a lot of people were struggling with addiction, mental illness, and so many of those people just fall below the radar of standard survey methodology. And I thought these were the most marginal people who were at greatest risk of being lost to follow-up, as we say in the survey methods business. And I thought it was especially important if we're really trying to understand the social and economic insecurity that follows incarceration, we exactly had to capture the people who were at greatest risk of being lost from the study. Right. So that was our mission, was retention, and it involved developing rapport, it involved getting a sense of the whole network of contacts around the respondents, and it involved paying the respondents, which I think could be tricky from a research ethics point of view. You're speaking to someone who's a long-time opioid user, and at the end of the interview, you're going to hand over $50 for the interview, and you're going to interview him again in a few months' time, but that was our method for retention.
Yeah. It's a foundational point, right? The Wall Street Journal just ran this editorial about there's no poverty in America anymore. Council on Economic Advisors put out this "There's no poverty in America anymore" point, and part of me is like, are you guys have you just gone outside? Yeah. And part of it's social science's fault though, for not doing the effort that you guys put in to really catch the bottom 5% or catch the bottom 10%.
I mean, I think so. I feel there's a long-running thread in our conversations. There is a large, enormously important research program on poverty that's in close dialogue with policy makers, relies on big social survey methods, administrative data, but the conditions of American poverty, I think, are very, very harsh by international standards, much more harsh than in Western Europe. People are living in much more fluid housing situations. Their economic insecurity is far greater. And this means that the methods that we use to measure poverty are actually particularly ill-suited to seeing the true depths of disadvantage at the bottom. And I worry a little about the enthusiasm for big data at the moment. I think those methods are not always well suited for people who face very, very extreme disadvantage, which is absolutely characteristic of American poverty.
Yeah, let's talk small data. Let's talk about the folks you met. And so I want to start with a vague question, but one I think is it's really central to the book, which is tell us where these folks came from, their homes and their livelihoods, how they grew up. A lot of times when you're describing the home life of the folks that you met coming out of prison, you use some variant of the word chaos, chaotic, unstable. Can you kind of break it down for us or give us an example of of a home that kind of typifies a lot of the homes that the men and women you met were coming from?
Yeah, most of the people we spoke to grew up in low-income families, poor families. We called the study the Boston Reentry Study. We were interested in talking to people who were returning to neighborhoods in the greater Boston area, but in truth, we were really only in about 5 or 6 neighborhoods in Boston. Incarceration is so socially concentrated in a small number of areas, and we're in the poorest high-crime neighborhoods in Boston for our 3-year field period. And but poverty doesn't fully describe the social origins of the respondents in the study. And as we got to know them, they talked to us, our respondents talked to us about a lot of violence that they had known in their lives, and it often started in early childhood. There was a ton of adolescent fighting among the people we were interviewing. So kids were getting in fights a lot in adolescence, running into conflicts at school. We're hearing so much about this sort of adversity in early childhood. We wound up significantly redesigning our exit interview. We developed a whole module that was trying to tap into adversity in early childhood, and we found there were very high rates of mental illness, suicide, criminal victimization among family members while kids were growing up. The kids themselves were exposed to a lot of violence in the home, and that meant they were either victimized by it or witness to it. A lot of kids, their parents lost legal custody of them while they were growing up, and that either meant they went into youth detention or into foster care. So, there was one guy I got to know really well. He was going to Catholic school growing up, and he was really into school, and he was doing well at it, and one day he woke up and his father said, I'm not paying for your school anymore. And he was about a week into his school year, and he came from a very fractious household. His father would beat up his mother, and so he was out of school. His father just announced 1 week into the semester, I'm not paying for school anymore. And so he was out of school, and he missed school that entire year. He was like 13 years old. In the course of that year, his father abandoned the family, and he was from Cape Verde, and the father returned to Cape Verde. The family was on the street. So within a couple of months, he was street homeless. It took his mother months to get the family back on its feet, back into housing. He never returned to school. So he was basically out of school from age 13 or 14. Then he went into youth custody. He had to go to school in DYS, they call it in Massachusetts. But it was not any sort of educational program. And and from that age on, he was just running the streets.
So so what does that mean? When we look at a lot of ways that mass incarceration is discussed out in the broader public as there's people, they did bad things, and they're the perpetrators. And you read your book, and you're left with a different. You're left unsatisfied with this binary between perpetrator and victim. The perpetrators were victimized, and they victimize. And so, when you look at this broader context, where does that leave us, or how do we engage that kind of binary that's out there and is so powerful today?
Right. You're exactly right. The system draws this very bright line between victims and offenders, and you're either one or the other.
Right.
And but none of the people we spoke to fell neatly into one of those two classes of people. People were victims of serious violence, they witnessed serious violence, and certainly a number had perpetrated serious violence. And so how is this the case, right, that people come to play all of these roles? And the violence that people were talking to us about was often of a very contextual kind. You're in a social environment, like a chaotic household, like a high crime neighborhood, in which violence is likely to occur, and you're going to get tangled up in it one way or another, and you'll be victimized by it. You'll see it on the street or see it in your in your home. To me, it makes me think. So where do we find justice then? Right? And the criminal justice system tries to find justice by punishing the offender. I came away from our interviews thinking we find justice in abating these contexts which are so ripe with the possibility of violence. That's what justice looks like. And I think if we really take victims and victimization seriously, harsh punishment of someone who has harmed someone else is a very incomplete way of doing justice for victims, because people who have harmed others have histories of serious victimization themselves. And if we take that seriously at an ethical level, I think at a minimum we have to think about mitigation, but I think it actually poses a really fundamental challenge for the conventional framework of criminal justice. Yeah.
It's like criminal justice policy and anti-poverty policy are the same thing, right? It's like, when the welfare safety net phrase, often there's someone beneath it with a badge and a gun, right, ready to catch that. And so that's one takeaway from this, right? I want to stay on violence, actually. I want to kind of drill into violence because I think it's hugely important for understanding, I think, the debate, and I think your book has a lot of new things to say about it. So we get into efforts to reduce mass incarceration, and everyone wants to pick the low-hanging fruit of the nonviolent offender, right? We kind of say, people that sold a few bags of marijuana, they shouldn't be in prison. Agrees everyone. And but is there such thing as a nonviolent offender? If you're a street-level drug dealer, often that's a violent job, and you've done or have had violence done to you. And then does this kind of distinction between the violent and nonviolent offender, morally uphold the nonviolent offender at the expense of the violent offender, kind of thrusting them deeper into the kind of like pit of undeserving? And aren't most people in state prison violent offenders? And what do we do about that? How's your experience, working in this field and talking to men and women coming out of prison change how you think about violence?
So I think when I first started to get into this research, and I sort of had my poverty hat on, I didn't take seriously enough the problem of violence and other crime. And I think this is a huge problem for politically liberal researchers, honestly, in this area, and those that, particularly those that study the criminal justice system. And we have to look in a pretty unflinching way at violence as a serious social problem that attaches to conditions of poverty. And it's really complicated from, I think, from a sociological point of view and from an ethical point of view. I do think the violence that we learned about is characteristic of social contexts more than of the disposition of individuals. And the criminal justice framework, I think, sees violence as a characteristic of individuals. So when we talk about, the non-violent drug offender, that's a characterization of an individual's disposition. Right. And I don't think that's the right way to think about it. There's no question in my mind that street trade in drugs is a really dangerous business. People get ripped off all the time, and they get ripped off by force of arms, and they protect against that by carrying firearms themselves or having ready access to guns. That's part and parcel of doing business in that world, and sometimes things go wrong, and people get hurt, and then so there's that, and then there is often the very deep trauma dating from early childhood in the biographies of people that wind up in state prison. Really serious victimization, and that's violence too. And so this categorization of people as violent or non-violent, I think, which makes violence an individual attribute, is the wrong way to be thinking about violence, both in public policy and as a matter of analysis. So what do we do with that? I think if we take on board the victimization that people have suffered and the idea that violence attaches to context rather than to individual dispositions, I think that opens the door to mercy and leniency in sentencing, in our propensity to punish. I think it expands the role for social policy. Social policy is anti-violence policy. Improving economic opportunities in poor communities is anti-violence policy. And I think we have to expand our vision that way.
You brought up earlier a bit of resistance that some liberal writers and liberal academics have toward looking at violence. And there is a long tradition among progressive academics of writing about poverty in a very sterile way. Clean up the house before the guests arrive kind of thing. But here's a book. It's about violence. It's about drug addiction. It's about people loving their family members, but also exploiting them sometimes. It's about childhood trauma. It's about really hard things. And I'm wondering if you wrestled with that as a writer and thought about this kind of decision about writing about these more uglier, more challenging bits of the social problem.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you did too. You did. I mean, you. This is a leitmotif, I would say, in your work, and I think it makes a break with a certain tradition in sociological poverty research. I mean, when you were confronted with that in the field, how did you decide to?
I feel like you have to write honestly about people's lives. I feel like you have to write about their hardships without reducing them to their hardships. And I remember going back and reading this story to this young woman I call Crystal in my book, and you remember her story ends really hard, and she's, I think she's 18 or 19 when the book ends, and her story ends in the book, and she descends into street homelessness and street prostitution to eat, and she had burned through all her bridges, and I read her that part of the story, and I looked up at her, and she was just like, I knew there'd be some personal stuff in there, but that's how it was, and that is how it was, and I think that for me, if you don't write about that, you do kind of injustice to the lives of people that we're trying to write about. You don't do them any benefits by trying to avoid the harder bits of their life, I think. And you leave room for people that kind of don't care about them to fill that void that you've created. If you're not going to explain something, right, you just invite a vacuum for folks to come in and fill it. And so you should talk about why there's a big TV in a house, for example, that has a hard time paying its rent or things like that. I feel like that's part of our responsibility too. What about you?
I agree with that, but I think the big challenge that creates, and I think I also tried, to paint the people that I came to know in a fairly unvarnished way, because people are complicated, and some people who go to state prison are especially complicated, but the thing I really worry about, or I think one of the challenges it presents is, are we pessimistic about the problem of poverty in America? Does people are facing enormous hardships. Some of it is very, very structural. The structural forces are overwhelming. Some of it is of their own making. They have agency in it, and sometimes it's hard to distinguish between what's structural and what's agentic. I wonder if it sort of takes the analysis to a darker place, right? And
I feel like you took the analysis to I don't know if it's a darker place, but it's a more humble place in a way. I want to get my, I'm already I'm not even 40, I'm already forgetting stuff. So there's this moment in your book where this is on page 62. All right, this is what you write. I know, right? What is the significance of dignity for public policy? For the most fundamentally disadvantaged, stable and independent housing, employment, and a functional family life might be out of reach. We can nevertheless respect human dignity by enabling the effort to struggle for it. We can provide help with education, sobriety, anger management, parenting, wellness, and so on, even when the outcome is uncertain. So that seems to me like you splitting the difference between those two positions, like a realistic look at poverty and versus a nihilism, where you say we should do this just on the basis of human dignity and moral urgency. And maybe our return on investment isn't great, maybe it's not going to be great under these conditions, but that's the wrong question.
So that's where I landed, and I think, and there are two sides to this too. One is do we allow people their dignity by providing them with housing programs and drug treatment programs, and we know some people are going to relapse to addiction, and some people won't live in the housing that's provided to them. But we respect their dignity by providing the opportunity to them. That's one side. The other side is, who are we?
Right.
Who are we as a society? Are we going to treat people with dignity? Because if we can't treat people with dignity, what does that make us?
Right.
Actually,
Yeah.
and so that was how I tried to resolve this issue. You know, in today's political climate, could that argument gain traction? You know, that seems quite challenging.
I don't know. Well, I don't know. It's something that I was thinking about with respect to this because, you know, I think that one thing that happens among progressive circles is they blame the Republicans for everything, and maybe vice versa. But this is a bipartisan creation, right? Mass incarceration. And it seems like there's been strange bedfellows moving forward where kind of libertarian folks are teaming up with anti-incarceration folks and going forward. So the politics of it are kind of interesting, right? In a way that's different or makes it unique from a inequality standpoint.
I'm completely encouraged by this as well. And some of the most interesting reform activity is happening in red states, and political conservatives are getting behind the project of criminal justice reform. There are two, this is a bad metaphor, there are two third rails. I don't think you can have two third rails in these politics. One is the problem of violence for liberals. We are allergic to treating violence with the seriousness that it deserves. And I think from the liberal side, the criminal justice reform argument is largely a civil rights argument about over-incarceration, particularly racial disparity. And the third rail on the conservative side is race. It is very difficult, I think, to engage conservatives in a serious discussion about institutional racism, the historic legacy of slavery, which I think casts a huge shadow over the politics and public policy of crime control. And so I think that, that's where I would love to force the conversation. I think if we can make criminal justice reform in a fundamental way, it'll depend on engaging the problem of violence in a serious way and having some sort of reckoning with the historic legacy of slavery.
Yeah. I want to ask two questions and open it up. One question is, all right, so we talk about mass incarceration, criminal justice reform, and that feels very far away from what I'm doing every day. So what if we wanted to get involved in this issue, what would we do? Just something we could do tomorrow or tonight to start getting involved in a bigger way.
Yeah. So there are a ton of local organisations to get involved in, and New Jersey is it's a pretty advocacy-rich, policy-rich setting, and I would encourage students and others who are interested in this area to connect with those organisations. There are typically two ways to plug in. Some of them are direct service organisations, and they have active volunteer programs, and they're important. I think, Brian Stevenson says this thing where we need to gain proximity to the problem, and doing that service work is really important for gaining proximity. The other way to plug in is through advocacy organisations, and they need help too. And there's a lot of very interesting criminal justice reform going on in New Jersey, and so that is something you can do tomorrow. People should visit so we're starting this project at the Columbia Justice Lab called the Square One Project. What if we were to reimagine justice in America from square one? People can visit our website, which is squareoneproject.org, and plug in there too.
Squareoneproject.org.
Yeah.
Plug in the website. Yeah. Yeah, got to do it. All right, so
I just did my media training yesterday. They told me to do that.
all right, so I know you're still involved with a lot of the men and women you met through this study. The study's wrapped up, but they're not just study participants. They're friends. You've done holidays together with them. You've had them to dinner. You're involved in their life, and I just want to, how has that affected you? How's your life been impacted by the study in ways beyond, the things that usually hit the page?
Yeah, they're very important relationships to me. I've learned a lot from the people I've got to know in the study, and I've learned a lot in particular from, people who I've gotten to know as friends. For some of them, it's been a really difficult path. I would say I'm sure I harbored the naive belief that by nurturing these friendships, I could help people. But that was wrong, and I'm not sure that's a particularly healthy way to think about friendships in any case. They're people I've got to know and learn from. I think sort of to zoom out from that question, one of the great tragedies of mass incarceration is the incredible waste of human potential. Right. People are brilliant and creative and funny and wise, and that's been the great thing about getting to know people from the study.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much, Bruce. So we're going to open it up for questions now. There's 2 mics. My boss asked me to encourage students to take the first question. And so there's a mic on this side, there's a mic on this side. I think we could also just do with talking loud too. I think that would be okay, and if no one can hear it, I can repeat the question. There's a mic right behind you though, man. You got no excuse.
Hello, my name is Remy. I'm a sophomore here. Probably gonna major in this building. I've been interested in criminal justice for a really long time, especially sort of the human side. And I have the amazing opportunity this semester of taking a class called Poetry and Belief. It's in the English department here, taught by Jeff Dolvin. It's actually an inside-out class, so it's 6 Princeton students, 9 incarcerated students, and we go in every Wednesday to East Jersey State Prison, and we talk about poetry and belief and religion and all these like really interesting concepts among a group of people who come from incredibly diverse backgrounds. And so our classmates on the inside are like 30, 40, 50 years old and just have very different life experiences from us. And every week I go in, it's this amazing, like you said, this human potential, right? There are so many insightful and incredibly intellectual comments made by my classmates. And I just know that, the other side of it is that there's so much sort of dehumanization that comes with the rhetoric and even within those communities, right? One of the big things that separates incarceration from, from sort of Jim Crow era policies is that it's not only, Black communities who are being oppressed, but also like within those communities, there's this stigma and this shame of like, you are morally culpable, right? And I just wonder if you could speak a little bit to, how people who are in those situations can overcome that feeling of being dehumanized or being their knowledge and wisdom and experience being delegitimized because of that label that we put on them.
Yeah, it's a good question. The prison classroom, for me, is a really intense setting. And you know well, right? You got to sort of strip down just to your materials and things you can take in. You leave your wallet and your phone and your keys all behind in the locker, and you go through the metal detector and through the trap and get often escorted to the classroom, and you wait for the people who are incarcerated who are in the class to arrive oftentimes, and you feel that time is very precious. It can be eaten away in different ways by a count or a riot button or something like that. People are super prepared. They're ready. They're ready to work. I think those sorts of educational settings and experiences are profoundly humanizing, and that part of their power is that they're standing in defiance of the institution, which is not about allowing people to use their minds and their imaginations, and yet that's exactly what's happening in that classroom. So I think we need to think about experiences like that can reinforce the full scope of people's humanity, and it can take different forms. It doesn't have to be a classroom. It can. In Massachusetts, they had work fellow programs, and people were working at jobs on the outside. I think things like that can be enormously important. Activities in the life of the prison, coming out on the outside after incarceration. I think it depends on expanding opportunities, allowing people to live their full humanity. I think, and we could list a dozen public policy measures that could help support that, from the expungement of records to the elimination of collateral consequences, to job and education programs. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. Henry, I'm a master's student at the Woodrow Wilson School. So I actually just finished Professor Desmond's book, and seeing the two of you next to each other made me kind of think about two sides of a coin. One kind of an upstream and the other downstream. And both of that is kind of this larger system of institutionalized disenfranchisement and oppression. I guess to make a quick analogy to another area, if you're talking about lots of children going into an emergency room for asthma, you need to have good facilities in a hospital to help the children, but you also need to go to the cause and kind of get mold out of homes in some senses. And I guess I'm thinking about we talk a lot about kind of downstream policy issues, and then also a lot about upstream policy issues, but we don't always talk about them as kind of mutually supporting each other. So I guess like I'm thinking a lot about how we were talking about the violence and a lot of the causes that people are exposed to that kind of
Got it.
Yeah. This is a good question, and it's kind of, that's a question I would sort of torture public policy students with, right? Because the question always is, where do you spend the next dollar? How do you spend the marginal dollar? And as you say, all these things are interlocking, it seems to me. It is, we could take someone over the life course, and people certainly make the argument at the end of the Obama administration, it was a very strong priority to make investments in early child development. And there was an argument that, that's where you really get the return. The challenge, of course, is that for those young children, which we're trying to make a public policy investment, they're living in a home environment with their parents who are grappling with all of these downstream issues that you described, and they're living in neighborhoods that are replete with other people, all at different stages of the life course, who are struggling too. And so I come back to the importance of more structural changes. In the area of criminal justice, I think what that means is trying to disrupt a logic in which we're essentially punishing racial inequality and socioeconomic disadvantage. And policy changes that are detaching relapse to addiction, for example, from incarceration. That to me is a good and worthwhile policy change. And so I think the upstream downstream metaphor, for me, that doesn't get us to where we want to be, because there isn't a neat causal sequence of events by which someone becomes enduringly poor. Instead, there's a whole interlocking set of institutions and social conditions that anti-poverty and other kinds of policy needs to pull apart, like breaking the link between addiction and incarceration, for example.
I'm going to go in the very back.
Hi, I'm Abby. I'm in the sociology department, undergrad at Princeton. And I know you said you just started this project, but I'm interested by the Square One project. And if you could maybe speak a little bit about, as you begin to reimagine the criminal justice system from a blank slate perspective, what are sort of the core values or tenets of your sort of imagination of what criminal justice could begin to look like?
Yeah, and I should say this is very much a project aimed at practitioners and policymakers. It's trying to change a narrative around crime and incarceration. And so it's not a research project. I think of this project, and a lot of what we're doing is convenings of different kinds. And so we've just come off a race and justice forum in Durham, which was fantastic. I think there are two values that underpin this project. One is human dignity, and that has some currency in criminal justice jurisprudence, and It means treating people in a way that respects their capacity for loving relationships and creativity, and that's conceived as a characteristic fundamental to the human condition that all of us enjoy. And so we want our system of justice to elevate people's human dignity. And in concrete terms, I think that means we should have limits on solitary confinement in prison. We should limit the stigma of criminal conviction after people come out, and by restoring their voting rights and restoring their rights to welfare benefits and licensed occupations and all of that. So human dignity is one value, and the second value that I think is important for Square One, reimagining justice from its foundations, is social justice. And social justice means a fair distribution of rights, resources, and human capabilities. And so we respect a certain conception of the individual, and we respect a fair distribution of rights, resources, and capabilities across individuals.
Hi, thank you so much for your work and your time here today. So I assume because most of the people whom you interviewed in your book were in the first year out of prison, did most of them have contact in some way with the parole or probation system? I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to, in addition to the lifelong stigma of a criminal record and the legal stigmas that we attach to that, how specifically did the parole and probation systems weigh on the people you were thinking about?
Yeah, about half of our respondents were under some sort of community supervision, either on parole. There's a lot of what they call split sentences in Massachusetts, and a lot of people on split sentences were on probation after they came out. These agencies, as they operated in Massachusetts during our field period, were essentially surveillance bureaucracies. They were monitoring conditions of compliance, and that meant chiefly regular drug testing, avoiding new police contacts, and regularly meeting with your parole and probation officer. They just had very little to offer the project of social integration that we would want to follow incarceration. And at some level, you know, you can't blame individual POs for that situation. You know, they have caseloads of 70 or 80 people that they have to meet. Oh, I left out one absolutely important condition of supervision: pay your supervision fees, which was $65 a month in Massachusetts. So we know this, right? That when you're on parole and probation, you got to pay for that, and so monitoring conditions was all that the POs had time to do. And if I were to ask you, if you were to meet someone coming out of state prison, how much time and resources would it take you to help get that person back on their feet and into a productive life? Would you have to spend all day with them every day, or half a day, or would you meet with them an hour each day? The POs met with people once a month for about 15 minutes, and that's mostly what they had time to do, given the resources. And so one implication is clearly, I think, probation and parole are kind of broken institutions, and if we were to re-examine those institutions from square one, I think one implication is, what are we getting? What are we getting out of probation and parole? What if we spent that money entirely on the project of social integration. Are we getting anything out of all of those drug tests and fee collections? So I would raise that question. I think it's at this point, community supervision is mostly a burden on people coming out of incarceration.
Yes, sir.
My question has to do with something we could be doing and we're not doing. And it seems like it could be very effective and maybe not that expensive. In Trenton, half the kids in their freshman year in high school drop out. Half. And that's not an exaggeration. Out of high school, well, you can't get into trade school. I learned today that 70% of these kids end up in prison. It doesn't surprise me. My question is, why don't we, when they drop out at 15 as a sophomore, why don't we put some energy, we should call them truant officers, into this kid to find out what's going on in his life and try to fix it. And there doesn't seem to be any effort in trying to do that, and it seems obvious. The other thing is that the administration has no incentive to keep this kid in school. In fact, they have incentive for him to leave because that means they get rid of the troublemaker, they have less kids to educate. So the administration is not opposed to these kids dropping out. There's no one there to give him the support or her the support that they need. And that is a pivotal point in their life. And we're not doing anything about it. And I don't understand that. Why, and you guys are the experts. Why aren't we as a society, or at least in New Jersey, why aren't we focusing on these sophomores and freshmen and fixing or trying to fix whatever's in their life? If we could save 2 kids out of 10, that would be, and move that 50% number to, 55%, that would be a huge contribution and perhaps not a big cost.
Yeah, and so one answer is, of course, and I'm sort of speaking for Massachusetts, but I suspect it's similar here. One answer is we are doing it, of course. We are making that investment, but we're not making it in Trenton. I think of where my kids grew up in Brookline, Massachusetts, which is sort of one of the leafy, well-heeled suburbs of Boston. Kids are getting into trouble. Kids are smoking too much weed. They're drinking too much. They're vandalizing property. They're adolescents. When that happens, what happens? A massive support structure springs into place for those kids. The cops in the town of Brookline are not about putting kids into the system. They're about keeping kids out of the system. And then kids in my upper middle class neighborhood, there is an incredible 4-year program that helps bridge the gap from adolescence to adulthood. An unbelievably successful program that does that. And it's called college. And these are peak crime-prone years. Kids are committing a lot of crime. They're doing a lot of drugs. They're busting up property. They're getting in fights and all of this sort of stuff. But there's this social environment that is not organized around the threat of sanctions and criminal justice punishment. In fact, it's organized around exactly the reverse of that. So I think, this is what our upper middle class communities look like, is the model for the kinds of social investments that are needed in more disadvantaged communities, and our upper middle class communities are safe and people are flourishing and community health is high, and that is not happening through a lot of policing and incarceration. It's through social investment. So I think the models are there, and I don't want to suggest that the social problems aren't challenging. They are challenging, and that means that they'll cost real money.
How do we get that Brookline model into Trenton? How did we get into Brookline?
We could stop funding our schools just through property taxes, so there's a rich kid school and a poor kid school. Like, that's an insane thing we do in the United States of America. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for coming to speak today. You talked about the progressive third rail criminal justice reform. Promising approaches going on across the country with violence reduction in a progressive way that isn't just the answer that we often turn to, which is over policing, over incarceration.
Two sorts of things. Most of my work and thinking is focused on what we call the back end of the system. How do we respond to violence after it's happened? I think there are really interesting experiments in accountability, I would call them, based on restorative justice principles that are not fundamentally punitive, very victim-centered, trying to address the needs of victims and putting that front and center in any process of responding to harm in communities. And I think there are some, the Common Justice Program in Brooklyn, which works with surviving families of homicide, is a very powerful and important anti-violence program that's non-punitive in its design. At the front end of the system, I think there are violence prevention. There's a lot of programs that are trying to gain proximity to the really prolific sources of violence, the street corners where the most shootings are, where a lot of the murders are, very community-based, based on community street workers. The ceasefire program is like this. Gary Slutkin's Cure Violence program in Chicago takes a very strong public health perspective on anti-violence. And from the Cure Violence perspective, violence is a disease, and it follows epidemiological sorts of principles. You come into contact with it, you become a vector of violence in one way or another, either through victimization or offending. I think what's really interesting about that very, very strong public health perspective on violence, and I think there's a larger policy lesson here, is that it's fundamentally non-blaming, right? A public health perspective is non-blaming compared to the criminal justice system, which deep in its nature is a blaming institution. It adjudicates guilt or innocence and then metes out punishment. Right. So this is what the alternative could look like.
We have time for one more question, and then we can continue the conversation at the book signing after it. Please, sir.
Yeah, I'm a retired psychologist. My first job after graduate school in the late 70s was working in a free outpatient psychological program for ex-offenders here in Mercer County, and I learned a lot. My later job was with, I worked for 15 years in Trenton Psychiatric Hospital, and I tie the two together in the sense of the impacts of institutionalization and some of the subtleties around that you've touched on, but necessarily having to look at those things and how it impacts those people, no matter what shape they were in when they went in, because there are cultures in all of those places. And I'll end with, most of us here are not going to work in either of those places, period. But if you decide you may want to, that's one way to try to start to impact changes. Thank you.
That is a great note on which to end. Thank you very much.
There you go. Bruce, thank you so much for coming down. Thank you everyone for your questions.
Thank you.
So Homeward, beautiful cover, by the way, beautiful. It's for sale outside. Bruce will be out there, and then if you want to continue the conversation, so thanks.